Hi everybody, it's Adam from LUCIDPIXUL, and today I'd like to talk to you about clarifying the core skills that you need to have artistically, what you are expected to have when working professionally. And although this might seem like a very kind of common general question, it's actually one of the #1 questions I get. Namely because I know, and I can relate this to my own experience, knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, there's a lot to learn. It can be very difficult to figure out what they are, right? You reach out to friends and different people have different focuses on different facets of art. And it's very difficult to get a good, well-rounded skill set that'll help you produce the type of artwork that you want to produce. With that said, I want to take a bit of almost a point form approach to this, because I want to make it clear. I want to make it very straightforward for you so that you can reflect on your own art, cross-reference what I'm saying with your own art, and ask yourself, do I have weaknesses in certain areas? All right? So to get us started, the first fundamental thing that any artist from any walk of life, be it design, illustration, fantasy art, if you're working on trading games, if you're working on video games, if you're working, if you're a fine artist, if you're a cartoonist, animation, especially if you're in animation, is a very good, solid sense of three-dimensional form and perspective, okay? Now, don't let that scare you. I know the word perspective is a scary word to a lot of people, namely because it's very technical, right? It's almost purely technical, and perspective very often risks pulling you away from the creative form of expression, okay? Very often people who start a piece directly based on a perspective grid, so to speak, can find themselves lost in the abyss and kind of get discouraged at that point. But don't fret, okay? Let's first talk about volume, okay? And when I talk about volume, I'm talking about three-dimensional volume. Very often you can tell, one of the first key things you can tell when looking at somebody's work, you can tell if somebody is experienced or more experienced or less experienced based on how they handle three-dimensional forms. And what that means is, when you're drawing something, you want to draw something from from full three-dimensional viewpoint. That doesn't mean you're drawing a character in rotation, but it means that you are visualizing around the form when you're drawing, okay? And when you're drawing the forms of the body, if you're drawing forms of a tree, forms of a house, forms of a car, whatever it is that you're drawing, you want to be able to both practically draw and visualize what that object looks like in 3 dimensions, okay? Now, of course, there's a lot of visual tricks to learning about form, learning to being able to best represent 3-dimensional form in a drawing, okay? But that is something that you definitely need to get a strong grasp of. One of the fallbacks of being a bit weak in that area is, and something that you can immediately tell when you're looking at people's artwork, is they tend to use the same generic pose all the time. They stick to somewhat more 2-dimensional angles, or they use the same angles all the time. There's a lack of dynamics, there's a lack of movement and fluidity and weight and gesture in your poses, namely because you're treating whatever you're drawing as a solid, flat 2-dimensional shape, instead of thinking about how this object is moving in 3-dimensional space. Okay. Now, of course, like I said, in animation, this is essential. This is the core of being an animator, because the whole point of being an animator is the ability to manipulate and move a pose and change angles and lift the head and rotate the head and things like that. So mastering 3-dimensional form is absolutely key when it comes to animation. But it's also something that's key to everything else that you do. Now, when it comes to perspective, however, okay, in perspective, what a lot of people do, and what really throws a lot of people off, is that when you're learning perspective, or you're trying to apply perspective to your own scene, what you do is you start with a grid, and then you try to figure out how to fit a scene into that grid. And that, to me, is counterintuitive to anybody who works in a creative field, okay? Instead, treat perspective as a way to solidify an image that you've already created. So I don't generally start a piece with perspective. I apply perspective to an already figured out composition, an already figured out image, but I start without even worrying about perspectives to start off with, okay? And in most cases, unless you're doing vehicle design, unless you're doing mech design, unless you're doing like, an elaborate cityscape, then You don't generally have to worry about a third point of perspective. Okay? I find that people very often abuse a third point of perspective to death. They just abuse it to death. Everything is looking down at or looking up at dramatic angles. And from a narrative perspective, that might not actually complement what it is you're working on. In most cases, 1 and 2 point perspective is enough to get you going in most cases. And third point perspective comes in when you're trying to do something a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more of a dramatic camera angle, depending on the scene. Okay? But remember, start with the creative side of image creation first, and then apply perspective to solidify all those forms and to make sense and be able to visualize and allow your eye to travel through a scene. All right. Now, the next on my list is anatomy. My entire life before internet, when my only source of learning was school or books, or the odd TV show, which really didn't really exist, right? There weren't really any good art learning TV shows, not at least for me growing up, and that is everywhere I turned, it was always how to simplify anatomy, how to simplify human form, shortcuts, techniques, approaches, formula to understanding and capturing the human form. And that's good enough. That's good when you're starting, when you're just starting to start off, when you're just kind of sort of trying to figure out what the forms of the human body are. But there's a certain point where it becomes a hindrance, where there's certain parts of the body, there's certain elements, certain forms in the human body that no matter how hard you try to capture them, you can't. And that's because you don't necessarily understand the underlying form. So the way I teach in my mentorship, and what I strongly recommend is learn real anatomy. Real anatomy. Actual bones, actual muscles. Where's the origin? Where's the insertion? Okay? Learn about all the muscles of the arms, the shoulders. Learn about the bones intimately. Okay? But don't learn them from a artistic shortcut perspective. Learn them from a medical standpoint, the actual physical body. Now, that doesn't mean you have to learn all of the deep muscles of the body. You mostly only need to concentrate on the superficial. Superficial meaning the muscles that appear on the surface of the skin type of thing. But once you learn that, the mystery of the human form starts to disappear. And furthermore, one of the very cool things that you learn and realize once you start to learn true anatomy is that we as humans are just another animal on this planet. And our muscles and our bones are in most cases exactly the same muscles and bones you're going to find on every animal. It's just formed differently. So once you have that core understanding of anatomy, you can immediately start to learn how let's say a bird is different from a human, how a dog is different from a human, how a cow or a giraffe or an elephant is different from the human. But all of the muscles in most cases are similar, and they're even named the same thing. So it really facilitates it. And when you want to do a twist in the forearm and you want to figure out how the muscles work around the arm, you figure it out right away. Because you're not thinking about, how can I simplify that shape? You're actually looking at that form and saying, okay, this muscle's here, and then we've got our muscles over here, and then we got these muscles, and this connects to this, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, everything makes sense. And those things that really drove you nuts for years trying to get right, all of a sudden, you get them right. And it's a very, very empowering feeling. So my suggestion is learn it now. Don't wait 15 years to learn it like I did. Because everybody I ever knew always tried to use these shortcuts, and anybody with any knowledge of anatomy can look and say, the muscles of the arm are off. There's a bump there that shouldn't actually exist, or there's a bump missing that should be there, right? That type of idea. Now, once you've got all those fundamental, I consider those kind of like the core fundamentals just to get yourself started. Once you start to paint and actually start to use form, then the next thing you really want to start getting a strong understanding of is value and light. Okay? And these two elements are by far one of the most important elements needed to best capture realistic three-dimensional form. To actually capture something that feels real, that feels tangible, that feels solid, okay? But not in the generic sense. I have a three-dimensional sphere, I have the light in this direction, therefore light hits this side and it's dark on that side. That's only one 1/100th of the big picture. What I mean is learn the science of light, the behavior of photons, what they do, how they act and interact. Furthermore, how reflected light behaves differently on different types of materials, different types of surfaces. Okay? Once you understand that, then understanding the difference between rendering plastic or cotton or jeans or glass or cardboard or or stone or marble becomes very intuitive to you, because you can say, okay, the light's doing this and it's behaving this. It's when it's reflecting off of the surface, it's doing that. And the reason it has this kind of distortion on it is because the surface is like this. And from a scientific perspective, you can figure things out. And when you can understand things from a scientific standpoint, the actual behavior of photons and how they act and interact, how they reflect, how they diffuse, so on and so forth, it gives you the power to be able to render them and understand what you're rendering and capture it effectively. It also makes it a lot less difficult to figure out what you're drawing. You're not just looking at random shapes and values. What you're actually looking at is an actual action-reaction with photons that you can understand and apply practically to a drawing. And furthermore, value. Getting a solid understanding of value. If you've ever watched Tyler Edlin and I do the Brush Sauce Theater Contest, which is blowing up. The last one we just recorded, I think it should be going live in a couple of days, if not today. We had over 27 submissions. It's pretty intense. And one of the number one common themes that we could see throughout all of these pieces, or a lot of these different pieces of artwork, and what really helped distinguish somebody who was a more experienced artist from somebody who was starting out, was how they control their value. Okay, how to control it, how to use it artistically, and how to use it artistically and how to use it realistically to be able to make the image come alive, how to create focal points, how to create a sense of depth, how to render out different forms, that type of idea. So getting a solid understanding of light, a scientific understanding of light and value, is your best friend. However, value alone is excellent for people who have a very graphic... If you want to paint in value alone, which does exist, look at artists like Anthony Jones. He pulls it off quite gracefully, I might add, right? There's a lot of artists that do like to work strictly in value. However, one of the fallbacks of only working in value is it lacks life. It lacks the spark of life. It lacks energy, okay? And you can very easily, if you take let's say you do a beautifully rendered value sketch of something. It looks just beautiful, but you don't apply, and then you apply color to it. You take something that looks realistic, that looks aesthetically very pleasing, and you take something and you actually inject a soul into your artwork. But when it comes to color, okay, one of the things that I strongly stress with my students is color theory is, in many cases, almost entirely useless. Real color understanding starts here. It starts with how you learn to observe, how you learn to see. One of the greatest experiences I've ever had was when I was in university studying, when I was in college studying fine arts, because I studied animation in university. When I was in college, funny enough, one of the most exciting classes I had was art history. Believe it or not, everybody thinks it's kind of a prerequisite. And one of the reasons why was it was explaining the evolution. In this class, I had a very good teacher who explained the history of the human understanding of color, light, value, composition, all these different types of things. How, for instance, realists captured color and light versus how surrealists or pointillists or abstract artists, okay, impressionists, such as Renoir or Degas or Seurat, okay, how they started to interpret color. And as soon as I started to realize that, I remember walking out of one of my art history classes once and looking out at the world around me, just standing outside the college and going, the world just became a more beautiful place. And that's because I distanced myself. I demystified the whole importance of art theory, such as, complementary and triadic and analogous and all these different, color charts or plugins you can plug into Photoshop. And I started to actually use my eyes and observe and see. And as soon as I did that, I went, oh my God, the sidewalk isn't... I used to look at the sidewalk in the road and think that was gray and that was dark gray and that was light gray. No, that's purple, and that's yellow, and down there it's peach, and that's green. And all of a sudden I start to trip out. You know, it's like being on some LSD trip. You know, like, whoa, man, the world just became really colorful. Whoa, cool. You know, and I'm sitting there staring at the sidewalk, and my friends are going, you know, Adam, I hope you didn't start doing drugs. It's like, no, but check out the sidewalk. It's trippy. And they're like, intervention, right? So it's an absolutely eye-opening experience. But learn color by observing. Actually get up off your ass and go outside and look at the trees, look at the grass, look at all these things. Sorry, trucks. They've been doing a lot of construction in Montreal. Okay? That's where real color learning happens. You have to learn the practical approach to capturing and observing color. And then from there, once you develop confidence with that, you start to explore the how to abstract it. It becomes something intuitive. And a lot of artists, I remember even Marco Bucci, somebody who I quote all the time, a Canadian, said in one of his videos, and I really recommend you check it out. He says, color is always personal. It is, everybody sees and interprets and captures color differently in their art. As such, it's one of those key fundamental bits of knowledge that you need to have to find your own form of personal self-expression. No two people see and capture color the same way, okay? And it very quickly distinguishes one artist from the next. But you need to learn how to master the art of sight first. That's where real color mastery comes from, okay? But simply leaving color out or just applying it in a flat, boring, markery kind of way in your artwork can destroy even the greatest value painting on earth. So it's very important that you respect and give color the time that it deserves to capture it effectively, okay? And subtly. After that is composition. And I'm actually going to combine two. It's composition and visual storytelling. And although visual storytelling has been a subject that I've been passionate about for years, this has kind of always been the thing that I loved most, right? It's surprising I never turned out to be a comic book artist, because comic book artists are some of the best visual storytellers there are, because that's what they do. It's essentially visual storytelling, right? And when it comes to composition, okay, again, the whole approach to composition can be very often, especially in, you know, the fast food production type of setting that we live in today. You know, when working in production, you're expected to pump out a certain number of units per day type of thing, right? It can become very technical and methodical. Now, as a little disclaimer, because I was just talking about color, okay? When it comes to composition, taking a technical, straightforward approach to composition can, and very often is, very effective, right? Using the rule of thirds, using the Fibonacci spiral, right? It can be a very effective tool and something I use very often, especially when I don't necessarily have the time to be experimental with my composition. But those rules, okay? Fibonacci spiral, rule of thirds, vanishing point, framing images, that kind of thing. There's a whole list of different types of techniques you can use, are only the starting point. They're just there to give you a formula to get you started if you need it. But composition in and of itself is a form of expression. And furthermore, it is a form of visual storytelling. And this is why when it comes to my mentorship, I put a lot of emphasis on visual storytelling. How does your composition, how does your scene, how does your placement of objects, you know, set design elements, characters, lighting, how do all of these things function together to evoke an emotion, to make you feel something, right? It's not about just placing things functionally in a scene. It's about placing things in a scene and playing around with your camera angles in a way that makes people immediately catch the emotional message you were trying to share. Beauty, horror, suspense, eroticism, whatever, right? Once you start to get a solid grasp on how you can start playing around with your compositional elements to start telling a story, you're off, okay? And of course, if you combine that with all of the different techniques that I was talking about, then and you bring it all together into a single package, you're almost there, okay? You're almost there, but there's one element missing, and it's the most important element of all, and it's the most personal element of all, and that is creative freedom. Creative freedom is a skill that needs to be learned, okay? And to best describe what I'm talking about, you know, if you're old enough, if you're under, you know, legal age or whatever, and you haven't gone out, you probably haven't experienced this. But you probably have experienced this with your friends. You probably have experienced this with you know, in school or whatever the case might be. But if you ever go out to a club, and it's not like a salsa club or a swing club or something like that, where people, you know, walk into a club and immediately start to dance and get going, okay? Then what happens is, at the beginning of the night, it's very cold and stiff. People, you know, you often get that, you know, like this, they say the circle of girls, where they all stick their purses in a pile in the middle, right? And sometimes their shoes, they're all barefoot or whatever, and they're dancing with their backs to everybody, and they're all, the thing that's moving the most on their entire body is their head and their eyes. They're just looking around and going, oh my God, is anybody looking at me? And they dance and they're closed like this, you know? And then if some hippie walks into this club and goes, hey, let's dance, man. Yeah. Oh, people go, oh my God, she's nuts. You know, she's not nuts. She just doesn't give a shit, right? Or maybe she's even a professional dancer and's kind of gotten over the insecurity of letting go. Art is the same thing. We have that same sense of insecurity when it comes to really, truly just letting go and expressing ourselves, just going nuts with our ideas. Why? Because we take for granted as artists that personal expression is kind of exposing vulnerabilities. It's exposing some pretty heavy thought to people, either happy thought or dark thought or disturbing thought or whatever the case might be. That's why very often people who've had very traumatic upbringings very often make for some of the most powerful visual artists, because they experience a lot of heavy emotion, and they realize at a certain point that art is a powerful vehicle of self-expression without offending anybody, right? There's a big difference between painting a bloody, gory scene of death and murder and rape and, you know, and all kinds of things like that, versus murdering a bunch of people and raping a bunch of people, right? One is an artistic representation of something, and one is illegal, right? And it's a very powerful vehicle for that. But letting go, you have very, very powerful thoughts. And your thoughts generally tend to go in a certain direction. Maybe you're the class clown. Maybe you're the jock. Maybe you're very, very, you know, business orientated, and you come from a computer programming background. And yes, by the way, as a little disclaimer here, or a little illustration of what I'm talking about, one of my students who graduated never painted a day in his life, ever. He started my mentorship, and his entire career up to that point was a computer programmer. And after 3 weeks, ladies and gentlemen, you'd be mind blown on what this guy could pull off. He was an artist at heart, and he knew it, but he never actually had a chance to express it artistically. But when he did, people, like, to the point, he was so good to the point where people were going, dude, you've been bullshitting us. You know, there's no way you can learn how to paint that fast, you know? But he did. At least I believe he did. I like to think he did, you know? It's a pat on my back a little bit, but I digress, okay? When I was doing the Demons series, if you haven't seen them yet, go check out my YouTube channel. I have a whole bunch of character designs of different demons. I challenged myself emotionally and expressively in those pieces. Remember, I'm a father of 3. I come from a cartoon animation background. I have a pretty innocent type of lifestyle, right? In that regard, a very tamed lifestyle to a certain degree. But when I got into the whole demons thing, I really wanted to start digging into some heavy emotions, and I really questioned how people would respond to that. I wasn't sure if people would take to it, or they would be offended by it. You know, so like ridicule, for instance, who has weights hanging off of his dick, and or, you know, his stomach's been ripped open with these different gears, or you know, suppression, or anguish, who has, you know, metal shards dug into them. All I got from my Demon series was nothing but good stuff. You know, people going, wow, I loved it. I love the way you expressed yourself. I love the way you drew this. I love blah, 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 blah. I didn't get any negative feedback. I was expecting to get a lot of it. I was expecting people to go, dude, man, whoa, calm down. It didn't happen, okay? And it made me realize that people are, or didn't realize it then, but it was one of the things that helped reinforce the realization that people, as tame as we might be, are attracted to very visceral experiences, visceral happiness, visceral eroticism, visceral violence, visceral embarrassment, okay? And in the artistic form always tends to calm it down a little bit. It makes it digestible. One of the major reasons why, when I was a kid, they had a lot of these, cartoons for kids where they were talking about, kidnapping, they were talking about incest, they were talking about, all these different, very heavy subjects for kids, but they did it in cartoon form and played it right there along with the Saturday morning cartoons. And kids did not get offended. It was a way to educate kids without offending them, because in the artistic form, it was digestible. But of course, they did that live action. It would scare the shit out of them, right? The art form has more liberty in terms of personal self-expression. And what I'm telling you is, when you walk into the dance floor, i.e. open Photoshop, okay, and you start with an idea, you're still tight, you're still cold, your muscles haven't warmed up yet, right? Your emotional muscles haven't warmed up yet. Start drawing it, and then start asking yourself, how can I blow this out? How can I go out with this? How can I make it more? How can I push that pose? How can I push that expression? How can I push this color, push this move, push the narrative? How can I push all of these things to give it more and more emotional impact? And you'd be surprised just how far you can push it. And once you have pushed it, and you reach that zone where you're sitting there going, I like this, this really feels good to me. When you go back to your original, you're going to go, wow, I didn't realize how stiff I was in that first piece. Okay? So don't be afraid to let yourself go. One of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite artists and role models in my life growing up was Chuck Jones. I reference him all the time, right? And what he says is, and I probably quoted in one of my other videos, is never underestimate the power of the spontaneous thought. Sitting on the bus, and you're sitting there, and there's some guy in a black bomber jacket, and he goes and he reaches in to check his wallet, and you notice that the inside of his bomber jacket's red. And you go, oh, it'd be cool if I had like an elven character who had this green vest on, but it opened up like that, and there was this kind of like almost Venus flytrap pink on the inside of the vest, and just, oh, I like that idea. But what happens is, you lose it, right? You go on, and then something else distracts you. Go, ooh, shiny, and you completely forgot about that cool thought. But artistically, capture those thoughts. Artistically, make visual points. I have my cell phone, and I have Google Calendars, and I type in my ideas so that when I know that I have a moment off, I get a little pop-up and says, don't forget to paint that elf with the red vest, red interior of his vest. I go, oh yeah, okay. And then I open Photoshop, and I start doing my stuff, right? Don't lose those spontaneous thoughts. And while you're painting, while you're creating, you're going to get more spontaneous thoughts. Things are going to pop in your head. You might be having a conversation with somebody, and because you're in the zone of your painting and you're brainstorming it in your head, when you're having that conversation, somebody says something about, like, you're talking to your mom, and she's talking about how she hung a bunch of colorful glass bottles on her tree, and you go, oh yeah, it'd be cool if I had some like bottles attached to his belt. Remember it and throw it in. Design, decorate your piece, add design and narrative to your character and to your sets. Don't be afraid to just throw things in, and very often it's those very things, those little spontaneous last minute things that you throw into a painting that people appreciate the most. Believe it or not. You can spend 6 weeks working on a character, and then that last little detail, everybody compliments the detail first, right? So never underestimate the power of the spontaneous thought. All right. So with that said, as I mentioned at the end of every video, remember that I have an online intensive 8-week mentorship. It's very inexpensive, and you can go on, if you go to adamduff.com, I'm going to have the link in the description. You can also read some new testimonials that a lot of my awesome students have put up from existing and existing students and some of my alumni as well. So you can go and check that out if you're interested. And I still do have a few spots open, not many though. Remember, it's a first come, first serve thing. So don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you want to start soon. And with that said, thank you very much for listening, and happy painting. Take care.